Hello friends, welcome back to my YouTube channel Oracle DB Online Training. So in this session we are going to look at what is Oracle Cluster Registry, that is also called as OCR, and we are also going to look at voting files, or sometimes it is called voting disk. Okay, so we will be covering the entire detail in this tutorial. So after completion of this tutorial, you will be able to very good understand what is OCR and voting disk and how to manage them, what is its significance. So please watch till the end of this video so that you can understand everything clearly. Before we move further, I'll request all the new friends to please subscribe our YouTube channel Oracle DP Online Training. So on this YouTube channel, you are already getting a lot of learning. So previously we have looked at how to perform, how to configure OEM 13C email notification, and even though we have covered so far different topics, you can go through the various playlists that we have on our YouTube platform. So you can also join our exclusive membership by clicking on the join button over here, and even though you can follow or follow me on various social media platforms. So without wasting much of time, so let's start with today's session of Oracle Cluster Registry as well as voting disk management. Okay, so I'll start this session. So the first thing that we need to understand, what is a OCR and what is a voting disk. So basically, if you look at Oracle Cluster Registry, it consists of a storage structure and a set of process. So whenever you talk about anything related to grid infrastructure, that the very good picture that comes in our mind is the storage structure. Okay, so and along with there are some various process which is basically up and running. So the storage cluster storage structure basically consists of piece of shared storage, and this is also including the very important part, that is Oracle Cluster Registry as well as a voting disk, and there are some two additional local files that is also called as a Oracle Local Cluster Registry and Grid Plug and Play Profile. So these four important basically pieces that make the shared storage in grid infrastructure useful. Okay, so the first thing, that is Oracle Cluster Registry, we need to understand what exactly it contains and what is the use of it. So OCR is nothing but it is used to store the cluster configuration details, and it stores the information about the resources that Oracle Cluster controls. So the resource that can be Oracle RAC database, or it could be Oracle instances, or it could be listeners, and even the virtual IPs. So everything, these are basically a part of your cluster configuration. Okay, so all the listeners, all the database information, or local VIPs, scan VIPs, so everything will be basically part of OCR configuration. So whenever we talk about OCR, so it is nothing but a collection of various configuration information about your Oracle RAC database instances, listener, and virtual IPs. Okay, and the next part is the voting disk. Voting disk, basically it is nothing but it stores the cluster membership information. This only stores the cluster membership information rather than all these other parameter like database name, listener, or anything. So whenever we talk about voting disk, it is nothing but a cluster membership information. And Oracle Clusterware uses a voting disk to determine which nodes are the member of the cluster. So this is also very important when we talk about voting disk. That means it will help us to understand which are all the nodes are member of the cluster. Okay. So Oracle Cluster Synchronization Service daemon, basically that is OCSSD, on each server node updates the voting disk with the current status of the node every seconds. Okay, so Oracle Clusterware Synchronization Service daemon, basically it keeps on updates the voting disk about the status of all the nodes within every seconds. Okay, the voting disk is used to determine which rack nodes are still in the cluster and should interconnect heartbeat between the rack node field. So that means suppose there is a two node rack database system, and in between these two nodes they keep on updating the status about all the information to the within the voting disk. So with the help of voting disk, we can basically determine which all the nodes are currently active and currently active member of the clusterware. Okay, so both OCR and voting disk have to be stored on the shared storage that is accessible to all the servers in the cluster. This is a very important, and even though they should be stored in ASM disk group or the cluster file system. So if you are always, it is recommended to move it on the ASM disk group. So but if it is not, then you have to make it on the cluster file system. Okay, and apart from that, to avoid a single point of failure, Oracle always recommend to you should have at least up to 5 OCR locations. Okay, and regarding the voting disk, it should be at least 3. Always keep an odd number of voting disks. So why it should be odd numbers? There is a always question comes in your interviews also, and that why we should keep voting disk odd number. So the logic behind this is like it should be more than half of your rack configuration. Suppose you have two node rack configuration, so it is always recommended to keep it more than half of your rack configuration. That means at any given point in time, each node is able to access at least 2 copies of the voting disk. Okay, so in suppose you have two node rack database setup, and if you want to have only even copy of like two copies of your voting disk. Okay, so in this case what will happen, suppose one of the nodes is getting down. So then after that what happens is the other node will have only a single copy of voting disk. That is basically not recommended. So you have to make sure that your voting disk has to be an odd number, and minimum it should be at least the 3 voting disk should be available. Okay, so like you can have 3, 5 or odd numbers. Okay, so moving further, how to check OCR and voting file location. This is also very important. So sometimes while doing any activity or anything, we have to make sure verify all the locations of OCR files. So what you can do, you can basically run the /etc or /oracle. So if you are using any Linux based operating system, you can use a cat command to verify the OCR location. Okay, so in this session basically we are not targeting about OLR, that is Oracle cluster, which is cluster registry, which is basically available locally. We are talking more about the OCR, which is a shared based cluster information. Okay, so that is available globally. So in if you want to know the location of OCR, you just have to run the cat command on this location, etc oracle OCR dot location. So it will provide you the exact location of. So we'll verify this part also in this session only. And apart from that, voting disk basically its location can be found by running crctl query css vote disk. Okay, so both will be running from the root users to verify the current locations, or even though you can execute the query from the grid user also. So it is always recommended to keep the OCR as well as voting disk on the ASM based disk groups. Okay, so this is one thing. So let me just verify this data. So if you run the cat /etc/oracle. So this is basically providing you the location of current location of your OCR. So you can see this is a this file. You can see this is the current OCR file. Even though there is a one mirror copy is also available. So this is basically plus data location. Okay. And even though you can run the from the grid user also, you can verify the CRSCTL. This is how you can verify your voting disk location. Okay, so currently my voting disk is residing on this path, which is nothing but my OCR disk groups. So this way you can all and this is the universal ID assigned to this voting disk. Okay, so moving further from here, we can just why it is necessary to keep the OCR on and voting disk on the shared storage. For that, we can say that the shared storage plays a very key role in the stability of the Oracle clusterware. And in case of any node of the RAC is not available to access the voting disk file that are stored in storage within a predetermined time threshold, that is the default of 200 seconds. That means if my voting disk is not available within 200 seconds, okay, so what will happen, your nodes will get evicted. So the RAC node will be getting evicted. This is basically also one of the important questions comes in your interviews. So if what is the threshold value of vote disk storage for getting the node reboot. So if within the 200 second, if the my storage is not responding, then that node might be getting the rebooted. And apart from that, if there is a network glitch of 30 seconds, then also it is possible to have the node eviction. Okay, so that is something that we should always know. And so why, coming back to why we should keep the voting disk on the shared storage. So it is a very significant role of voting disk and OCR, that it has to be on the shared storage. And as a so the database instances on the RAC node will always get rebooted. So once your cluster is rebooted, by default your database is also getting restarted. So even more seriously, if the OCR is on the storage is lost permanently, then in that case also the Oracle cluster where on the entire RAC cluster will be no longer functional. That means it is our duty to protect the entire clusterware. So in order to do that, it has to be on the shared storage to avoid any kind of node eviction. Okay, and so OCR needs to be recovered from its backup to resume the normal operation of the cluster. So suppose if my OCR file got lost, or due to some reason my cluster got disconnected because OCR is not available on the shared storage. In that case, what you can do is you can basically recover OCR from the previously taken backup. So this is a very important. You should regularly keep your OCRs files backup. Otherwise, in case of any issues, you might be losing your rack configuration. So next part is like what is the what are the redundancy that we need to use for voting disk. So external redundancy, basically it means that only one voting disk is available. And when we talk about voting disk redundancy as a 3, so sorry, normal redundancy, then in that case it will become as a 3 voting disks are available at any given point in time. And if we are choosing the high redundancy during the time of installation of our database, or even though during the time of creation of voting disk file location, at that time if we are choosing the high redundancy, that means we are creating 5 different voting disks. Okay, so while doing your RAC grid infrastructure configuration, it will ask you to provide the voting disk as well as OCR file location. So during that time, you can modify all these redundancies. So just keep in mind these things. What is the external redundancy for voting disk? So it is 1, and normal redundancy, basically 3 voting disks are available, and high redundancy basically represents 5 voting disks are available at any given point in time. Okay, so now moving further with what all the important commands that we need to use for managing OCR and voting disks. So first one that comes in my mind is OCR check. So OCR check basically it will provide all the copies of the OCR. So if I'll go back to my prompt, so from here you can run the OCR check. Okay, so OCR check basically it provides information about the cluster configuration, cluster registry files. Okay, so here you can see the device files name is OCR plus OCR and even the data. So basically we have the two separate copies of the OCR files. This is how you can verify, and sometimes we need to take or we need to add additional copy of OCR. So in this case, what you can do, you can run the OCR config hyphen add and the location of the shared disk group. So you just have to run OCR config add and then data disk group names. So this will add, and even though you can delete the OCR config, so using the OCR config delete OCR disk group to delete a copy of your OCR from the cluster. This is how you can do it. And so sometimes it is also required to move or replace your existing OCR configuration. So these are not regular activity, but we should be knowing what all the different commands that we can use to do various operations related to OCR and voting disk. So currently we are talking about OCR configuration management. So OCR config replace, and after that we need to basically provide the current location and replacement location. So with these two options we can replace any existing OCR disks. And moving further, we can also look at all the existing backup of OCR configuration by running OCR config hyphen so backup. So this will provide you the current detail of the OCR backup. So backup. Sorry, it's OCR config hyphen so backup. So you have to run OCR config hyphen so backup. So this is how you can verify the current existing backups. OCR config hyphen so backup, it will provide you the previously taken backup. Even though also you can take the manual backup also. At any given point in time you can take it. So basically you need to execute this command from the root user, otherwise it will fail. Okay, so using manual backup, OCR config manual backup, you can take any backup of. So during any major activities or during any patching activities, you can basically take the backup also to avoid any issues. And also you can restore your previously taken backup in case you are facing some issue, challenge with a current OCR file. So you can basically restore the files using the OCR config restore backup location. Okay, this is how you can recover. And the next part comes how to identify current voting disk. So you can basically run the CRSCTL query CSS vote disk. So it will help you to check the voting disk details. And sometimes we need to verify or even though we need to replace the voting disk, so we can use CRSCTL replace vote disk and the vote disk location. Okay, so with this, we have finished today's agenda. I hope you have understood what is the use and what is the importance of OCR as well as voting disks files. In coming days, we will be covering many such topics. So please subscribe our YouTube channels, and if you have any question, please send me details on the comment box or my email ID. Please go through the description. You'll get every details you need, and please watch our previous videos. Thanks for watching today's session. Have a great day. Bye.